When a sudden tragedy comes into an inventor's life, his eagerness to make a time travel turns into desperation to change the past. But when he succeeds in inventing the time machine, it suddenly takes him into a far future. Now that he is trapped, would he still be able to return to the present? Let's find the answer in the movie. During the 19th century, Dr. Alexander Hartdagen is calculating the differential coefficient for his research at his office. He's an inventor and a scientist who teaches applied mechanics and engineering subjects at Columbia University. As he writes the equation on the board, his friend, David Philby, eventually reminds him about his date with Emma tonight. Due to that, Alexander quickly stops writing, takes his papers to the table, and leaves his office to get dressed. Once outside the university, Alexander begins discussing his rejected utilizing solar-powered proposal for the reason of not being applicable to help humanity. David responds that Alexander's ideas are a bit too radical, to which Alexander quickly disagrees and blames the faculty for not considering his made concepts. After debating with David, Alexander immediately enters his house across the street to change his outfit. Then, Alexander calls Mrs. Watchett, his housekeeper, only to hear her saying that he received another letter from a German bookkeeper. Feeling irritated, David asks Alexander why he is wasting his time entertaining the German bookkeeper. Due to that, Alexander says that the German bookkeeper has thought-provoking ideas, such as inventing a time machine. Afterward, he finalizes changing his outfit. On the way rushing to meet with Emma, he suddenly realizes he has to buy her some flowers because he has promised her. However, as he wants to buy the flowers, he suddenly sees a car, which is a new thing at the time. Feeling mesmerized by the creative invention, Alexander forgets to buy the flowers and talks with the car owner instead. The owner then offers to give Alexander a perambulation, but Alexander refuses as he has a prior engagement to attend. So, the owner reminds Alexander that he can visit him tomorrow night for a charge-free perambulation. Afterward, he leaves while Alexander walks inside the park to meet Emma. Once inside, Alexander finally meets Emma, who is happily skating in the skate park. Then, they talk and Alexander feels mesmerized by Emma's beauty. Suddenly, Emma asks him about the flowers that he promised to give to her. Feeling nervous, Alexander apologizes and asks Emma to allow him to discuss something. Fortunately, Emma agrees and suggests finding a space where they could talk privately. Once alone, Emma notices that Alexander is shivering. So, Alexander musters up all his courage to propose to her. Emma is surprised and happily agrees with Alexander to be his future bride. Afterward, Alexander takes the moonstone ring from his pocket and slides it into Emma's finger. As they feel happy about their engagement, a mugger emerges from behind the bushes. The mugger then forces Alexander to give his money and pocket watch. Seeing Alexander hesitating, the mugger takes out his gun. Feared, he immediately hands over his money, pocket watch, and gloves. However, the mugger still wants more and forces Emma to give the moonstone ring. This causes Emma to fight off against the mugger to prevent him from stealing the ring. However, the mugger unexpectedly fires the bullet and kills Emma. After Emma's death, the sad Alexander devotes himself to inventing the time machine to change the past. He blames himself for Emma's death to the extent of being desperate to bring her back. When he solves the equation on his board, David suddenly emerges into his office. David tries to talk to Alexander, who has been isolating himself in the office since Emma's death. Alexander responds that he is just working on some experiments and also invites David to come by for dinner in a week to discuss his plan. Little does David know, it's only a trick because it will be their last conversation. Once David leaves, Alexander wears his coat and uncovers the time machine he made that will let him travel back and save Emma. In fact, it took Alexander 4 years to build it. After examining it, Alexander then starts to engine the time machine, which brings him back to 1899. There, Alexander meets Emma again and hugs her tight. Afterward, he immediately takes her in the carriage to prevent her murder and commands Emma to go home and wait for him there. But before she leaves, Alexander buys her flowers first across the street. However, the car that appeared earlier suddenly moves near her. It scares the upcoming horses of a horse-drawn vehicle, which causes Emma to get killed as the horses run over her. At this time, Alexander suddenly realizes that he cannot change the past, however he tries, and attempting to redo the past will only result in Emma's unforeseen death. After a while, Alexander suddenly tries to travel again using the time machine, but this time he chose the year 2030. He believes that the future may help him change the past through advanced technologies. After crossing into the future, Alexander decides to visit the New York Public Library. When he gradually examines the facility in the library, a holographic librarian called Vox 114 suddenly appears. It calls Alexander's name and asks what he needs. Due to that, Alexander asks Vox 114 about the practical application of time travel. He also asks about the reason for a failed attempt to change the past. Rolling his eyes, the Vox 114 tells Alexander that no one can travel into the past. Failing to find an answer, Alexander then travels to 2037, where he is arrested under martial law. Confused, he asks the military officer what happened, only to find out the moon is falling. To make it more precise, the military officer says that the demolitions for the lunar colony destroyed the orbit. Because of that, it makes the Earth nearly uninhabitable as the moon begins to break up. After saying that, the military officers continue to arrest Alexander. However, they suddenly see the falling moon nearly approaching, causing them to let go of Alexander and run away. Due to that, Alexander takes the opportunity to return to his time machine. He then restarts it as soon as he sees the debris is about to fall, hoping to avoid it. However, the debris ominously strikes the engine and causes Alexander to pass out. As the time machine travels, Alexander tries awakening himself to stop it, but passes out again. What Alexander doesn't know is that the time machine takes him on August 27th, year 913,812, a very far from the future. When Alexander is still unconscious, a young woman named Mara luckily finds him. She then aids his wounds and nurses him back to health. The following day, Alexander finally wakes up and gains consciousness. But then, he suddenly gets stunned as he finds himself in an unknown shelter. When Alexander examines the environment around him, he sees prepared garments. So, he wears the clothes and finds Mara's younger brother, Kalen, is waiting for him to wake up. Afterward, Alexander quickly follows him and discovers he is now in the far future. He gets stunned upon seeing the sides of the cliffs, full of their built shelters and the people living there. Now that the Earth has been restored, Alexander finds humanity returning to its prehistoric living. Suddenly, the people approach Alexander and ask him something by speaking the stone language. Confused, Alexander tells them he doesn't understand their words. Fortunately, Mara speaks English. She is one of the few Eloi who understands and still speaks the English language after the apocalypse. As Mara talks to Alexander in English, she orders him to have their discussion privately. Once alone, Alexander tells her that he's actually traveled here from the past through a time machine he built. So, instead of telling the truth, Mara informs the people that he has hit his head and is a wandering imbecile. Seeing people leaving, Alexander feels confused and asks Kalen what they are doing. So, Kalen tells him they're preparing for bedtime, and eventually Alexander follows them. Later at night, when Alexander and Kalen are talking, he learns these people are called Eloi. They are the people who survive after the apocalypse and live above the ground. Afterward, he tells Kalen about his life in the past until Mara orders Kalen to sleep. Due to that, Alexander stops talking and Kalen returns the pocket watch he is holding to Alexander. But instead of taking it, he gives the watch to Kalen. Since he can't sleep, Alexander then spends his night conversing with Mara before going to sleep. While sleeping, Alexander suddenly dreams of a terrifying jagged-toothed faced creature calling his name. Due to that, Alexander goes down the stairs only to discover that Kalen also dreams about it and he keeps saying Morlock. So Alexander informs Mara about this and learns that all Eloi people have the same vision. He asks Mara what Morlock means, but she refuses to tell him the answer. The following day, Alexander tours the place with Mara, finding stones that leave a trace of Manhattan. Alexander realizes that Mara must have learned English from these stones since they are engraved with English letters. While observing the area, Alexander gets questioned by Mara about why he traveled through time. So Alexander answers, saying he wants to solve his problem of why he can't change the past. She realizes that Alexander has lost someone, which caused him to redo the past. After this conversation, they go paddling to find Alexander's time machine. They eventually arrive at another place where people work to build windmills. Alexander then sees Carlin, who also works there. Thinking that he is here to work, Kalen takes his hands, but Mara tells him that she and Alexander are going to check his machine. So, Kalen sadly lets go of Alexander's hands and watches them walk away. Once the two arrive at the place, Alexander checks his time machine to see if it's still working. But then, Alexander suddenly hesitates about whether he should go or stay. Due to that, Mara pleads to Alexander to operate the time machine and leave the place together with Kalen because they are not safe. Suddenly, they hear horns and Mara runs as fast as she can to save Kalen. So, Alexander follows her and gets stumbled upon the ape-like monsters, or what they call Morlocks, with his own eyes. He then witnesses Eloi getting attacked by the Morlocks. Due to that, he immediately runs away from it and saves Kalen from them. It turns out that the Morlocks often hunt the Eloi for food. They grab Eloi people and then drag them back to the ground. When Alexander and Kalen are fighting Morlocks, they suddenly hear Mara scream nearby. At the same time, another horn sounds and all Morlocks run away. Unfortunately, Mara already gets dragged underground by them. Therefore, Alexander asks Kalen to help him lead the way to Morlock's nest to save Mara. But Kalen thinks that it is impossible for them to save Mara back because Morlocks are powerful for them to defeat. Thinking that Eloi might be afraid to fight back, Alexander encourages him to fight the Morlocks with him. Later at night, Kalen finally decides to help Alexander and takes him to a cave where Vox 114 is located. Stunned, Alexander learns that it is actually the New York Public Library, which is now a cave. He also discovers that Vox 114 is still functional after the apocalypse. Alexander then asks it about what is happening and how it knows about the Morlocks. Eventually, Vox 114 reveals the truth, explaining that one Eloi managed to escape from the Morlocks and told it everything he experienced. Asked how to find Morlock's nest, it answers that it is located in the eastern jungle and he can find it by following the Morlock's smell. Hearing this, Alexander and Kalen go to find the location. It only takes them minutes before reaching Morlock's underground lair. But before entering, Alexander tells Kalen that he'll go alone and orders him to return to the village and light a fire so they can find their way home. After that, Alexander reaches the underground through a hole he saw in his nightmare. As he enters the hole, he is surprised to find that the Morlocks are collecting stainless steel objects to fortify their lair. After walking for a while, he sees some creepy equipment, and that is when he realizes how they deal with the Elois they captured. He continues to find Mara, but accidentally falls into a creek, and unfortunately, a Morlock catches him. As he gets thrown into an area where they lock the Eloi, Alexander finds Mara sitting in a cage. So he tries to talk to Mara, but her eyes only focus on the intelligent humanoid Morlock. Due to that, Alexander turns around only to see he is no one but the terrifying jagged tooth-faced creature he saw in his dream. But instead of hurting him, the creature introduces himself as Uber and tells him everything happened here. According to him, after the moon collapsed, the Morlocks managed to live underground and that the ones who survived above ground are the Eloi. The Morlocks are very organized as some are responsible for capturing Elois and some are in charge of everything like Uber himself. As Alexander listens, he also discovers that Morlocks decide to breed themselves into castes due to their failure to re-emerge in the sun. Therefore, some Elois they captured are used to reproduce, like Mara, and some become food. That's why there are barely old people above the ground. Hearing this, Alexander feels angry and questions Uber how he cannot consider the costs of human lives when killing Eloy. Uber gets pissed off and says that he actually should be thanked for teaching Morlock how to develop sustainably. Otherwise, they will eat all Eloys at one time. It turns out that Uber is extraordinarily intelligent and can even read people's minds. So in fact, he already knows who Alexander is and why he is here. Afterward, Uber shows Alexander a nice vision in which he and Emma are living a beautiful life. But after that, Uber reveals that this can never happen and he can never save his fiancée. He explains what drove Alexander to build the time machine is only because of Emma's death. So if Emma had lived, the engine would never exist. Technically, Uber makes Alexander realize that he cannot change Emma's fate because it is impossible due to the temporal paradox. Afterward, Uber shows Alexander his time machine. He orders him to return home because he already has an answer to his questions. Seeing this, Alexander speaks nothing and slowly walks toward the time machine and gets inside. But before he operates it, he suddenly pulls Uber inside the time machine. Uber tries to escape, but Alexander already activates the machine to time travel. Afterward, they start fighting in the time machine. When he is almost getting killed by Uber, Alexander breaks the machine apart to push him outside the temporal bubble. Meanwhile, Uber tries to save himself by holding Alexander's neck, but Alexander takes the time machine into a different period. Due to that, Uber dies of rapid aging. After that, Alexander finds himself in the further future where he sees Morlock caves turned into ruins. At this time, Alexander decides to travel back to save Mara. But before they leave Morlock's underground lair, Alexander changes the future in his time machine. Afterward, he grabs Mara's hands to escape before the time distortion explodes. Finally, Alexander's plan works out as the Morlocks perish in the explosion, but the time machine is destroyed in the process. Now that the Eloi are safe from Morlocks, Alexander begins his new life with Mara and the Eloi in the far future. Meanwhile, Vox 114 is finally out of the cave and teaching the Eloi children to learn knowledge. Since it has access to everything, he uses it to educate the Eloi in building their new future. On the other hand, in 1903, Mrs. Watchett shows Alexander's laboratory to David while telling him that Alexander has been gone for a week. But Mrs. Watchett has no idea where Alexander went, and there is a possibility that she may leave Alexander's house because he is already gone. Meanwhile, David tells Mrs. Watchett he is glad Alexander disappeared because he may finally have gone to a place where he can be happy and find peace.